Okay, so we're going to start where we left off last time. And we've taken a couple of weeks to go through a survey of the Old Testament. We've talked about the kings. Now we're going back through and looking at the different kings. We've looked at Saul last time. And so we started on David last time. Sorry, Saul previously, David last time. And so where we ended was, we're here on lesson 4. We're probably not going to get to Solomon's reign, but if you've prepared that, don't despair, because we'll pick that up next time, and we might just combine that. That's what I said last time. These 3 lessons, we're going to just kind of take them all together, which is basically David and the temple, preparation for the temple, and then Solomon is put on the throne, and Solomon builds the temple. Okay, so we've looked at these 3 promises. We had the promise in Genesis 3, but if we take Abraham, Moses, David, we're going to be concentrating on that one about David this evening. All right. So last time we were looking at the historical accounts of this period, and there are 2. There are Samuel and Kings, and there are Chronicles. And this is kind of where we ended up. We said if you look at Samuel, anybody remember how 1 Samuel breaks down? You remember my little formula there? First 8 chapters are about the author, Samuel, if he's the author. All right? Second 8 chapters almost, Saul. And then the last 16 chapters about Saul and David. Okay, so you break that up, you got 1/4 Samuel, 1/4 Saul, half of it about Saul and David. And then when you go to 2 Samuel, it's all about David, and there are some of the highlights there. So we find about him consolidating the kingdom, bringing the ark to Jerusalem, the promise God makes to him, some of the conquests that he has, his sin with Bathsheba, and then the rest of his reign, which is to some degree troubling because of the consequences of his sin. And then finally, kind of an appendix where he has some difficulties, but God helps him through those. All right, let's compare that with 1 Chronicles, which is a little bit different. The first 9 chapters are genealogy. Anybody remember the genealogy, where it starts and where it ends? It starts back at Adam, all the way to Adam. And then it goes all the way through the exile, which gives us a clue as to the time of the writing of Chronicles. Originally, 1st and 2nd Chronicles were Chronicles. And they were the last book of the Old Testament because they were probably the most recently written book, which would have been about the time that the exiles were returning from captivity. Okay. So why this difference between the 2 narratives? There is, we'll look a little more at that. And so here on the right, you've got the genealogy, chapters 1 to 9. Saul's is repeated twice, and then chapter 10 is the only mention made of Saul in Chronicles. 1 chapter. Saul died. And then chapters 11 to 29 of 1 Chronicles, which we're going to concentrate on for now, David and his reign. Okay, so compare those 2. And notice on the right-hand side in Chronicles, a lot of attention given to David moving the ark and the promise that is made. And then look at chapters 21 to 29, which are not mentioned in 1 and 2 Samuel. David makes preparation for the temple. Now, what kind of message does that send about Chronicles? If you spent 8 chapters talking about preparing to build the temple, what's that telling us? It's important, yes. Okay, and David's taking great pains, even though he's not going to build it, to make sure his son builds it. Okay, so that's important, isn't it? So when you put those side by side, you've got some of those differences, and here's how we explained it last time. Who is this written to? That's our first question. We open up and read these accounts and say, well, what does this mean to me? And that's okay, that's good. We need to do that. But our first question needs to be, who was it written to and why? And 1 and 2 Samuel's was written to those who had been taken into captivity. So it was written a little bit earlier than Chronicles. And so that history has an emphasis on the failures of the kingdom, both united as well as divided, Israel and Judah. And its message is, here's why you're going into captivity. Okay? Whereas Chronicles, we said, is later when the exiles come back, so it's written to those who have returned. They come back to the land. Do you remember anything about that return? What did they do when they came back? What's one of the first things they did? At least they made a start. To build the temple. They didn't get it done until Haggai and Zechariah came along and said, you need to finish the temple, which they did. Do you remember their reaction to the temple when they built it? It was kind of a mixed reaction of what? Joy and sorrow. Why joy? We've built it. We've rebuilt the temple. Why sorrow? It's not as glorious as it used to be. Okay? So here are these exiles that have returned. Yes, they finally got that done. And so the emphasis is, as we'll see, on both the ark in the account with David, and then, of course, the temple, which represent both God's throne, we'll see that in a moment, and God's presence among the people. Now, why is that important for these returned exiles? In other words, both are historical, accurate accounts, but like the Gospels, some emphasize this, others emphasize that. Why would you emphasize with the exiles this presence of God's temple? And of course, the ark probably was not present, but the fact that God had been among his people. What's the state of mind when they come back from captivity? It's great to return, isn't it? But they come back to what? A land that's nowhere near like what it was before. And are they facing any opposition? Yeah, all sorts of opposition. And the thing we mentioned last time that kind of bears on our study is, what don't they have that they had before they went into captivity? They don't have a king. So what question might come up in your mind if you're a returned exile and there's no king on the throne and God made a promise to David that he was going to establish a throne forever? What would your question be? Where's the king? So I think in part this history is being written with an emphasis on what God has done for them to show them God's steadfastness and his loyalty to his people throughout their history, even when they sinned. How would that help them? If you're waiting for a king and you don't know when it's going to happen, what would this story tell you? Do you have a reason for some hope and optimism that one day God might actually accomplish what he said he was going to, even though it looks like at the moment it's not going to happen? Okay? I think that's part of what's going on here. So let me ask, what does this have to do with us? And let's take the right-hand side. We can deal with the left-hand side maybe some other time. Any kind of message for me when I read 1 Chronicles? And I'm aware that the exiles who returned are reading this history. God's explaining to them what he did with the people. Never abandoned them. Continual care, yes. Despite what it sometimes might, those 400 years during the time of that and when Jesus came might have seemed like, yeah, he really has abandoned us. But what finally happened? He sent the king who fulfilled all expectations, at least for those who were looking for the right kind of king. So again, what's the significance for you and me? Do you ever get disappointed or discouraged and it doesn't seem like everything's going exactly like it should if God's in charge? The world seems kind of mixed up at the moment. So what message can I take from this book about what God is able to do and willing to do? He cares a whole lot about his people, and he's going to be faithful to them. And sometimes it may not look so optimistic, and yet we can rely on him because throughout history he has acted again and again on the part of his people. Jacob? Okay. Okay. Okay, I think exactly right. So, ideally we'd have time to look at 1st and 2nd Samuel and compare it. Well, we don't have that time. But what I'm going to do this evening is go through these early chapters in 1st Chronicles and talk about some of the things that are in them. And if we kind of know 1st and 2nd Samuel with that history, and we're going to, the next lesson is going to be about the divided kingdom, and we're going to go to 2nd Samuel, no, 1st Kings for that. So we'll see that picture in the next lesson, but we're going to concentrate this evening on these early chapters, and I think there are some pointers in these chapters that really help us. I mean, I'm ashamed to say that I don't think I was aware of any of this before I looked at some of this closely. And I think there's a lot in here. So let's look at it. And notice it all kind of centers around the promise to David, chapter 17. So if you remember 2 Samuel 7 as the promise to David, remember 1 Chronicles 17. That's the same promise. All right, let's look at these. So let's look at Saul's death. Okay, why would we know Saul died? How did he die? Remember? He was fighting the Philistines up at Mount Gilboa, up in the north. I don't have a map. And he and who were killed? He and his sons. Okay? So verses 1 to 7 tell us about that. Look at verse 6. Thus Saul died, he and his 3 sons, and all his house died together. Now, did every single son die? No. Ishbosheth survives. We read about him in 2 Samuel. But I think what he's saying is, effectively, his family has been wiped out. And then Jonathan has a son, you remember his name, that couldn't walk because the nurse dropped him Mephibosheth, okay? But he's saying that family has ended. So look at verse 7. When all the men of Israel who were in the valley saw that the army had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, what'd they do? They ran for the hills, didn't they? They abandoned their cities and fled, and the Philistines came and lived in them. So here are the nemesis of the Israelites, the Philistines. What have they done? They've defeated Saul, and now they're moving in. Verse 7. All right, then Saul and the bodies are taken, desecrated, as we've said there, and then these men from Jabesh Gilead, which is where Saul had won his first battle when the Ammonites attacked the Jabesh Gilead over there on the other side of the Jordan. They came and got the bodies and took them back to their city. But look at verses 13 and 14 at the end of chapter 10. In fact, I'm going to back up a couple of verses. No, I went too far. Verse 13. So Saul died for his what? Breach of faith. He broke faith with the Lord in that he did not keep the command of the Lord, and also consulted a medium seeking guidance. So we get some insight into Saul. We would have suspected this. The other account tells us about it, but this spells it out for us. Look at verse 14. He did not seek guidance from the Lord, therefore the Lord put him to death, and turn the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. So God allowed it to happen because he said, your kingdom's not going to last. I'm taking it away from you. And that's precisely what happens. And the reason being, he didn't seek guidance from God. So that's what we're told in chapter 10. And notice who's affecting this. It's God that's doing it, isn't it? The kingdom's now going to switch from Saul, and it's going to switch over to David. All right. So let's go to chapters 11 and 12, which we've described here as, actually this was one of my earlier slides. David's reign and the mighty men is really chapters 11 and 12. That one's not very accurate there. Okay. So let's look at these two chapters. Again, look at the opening verses there, verses 1 to 3. Then all Israel gathered together to David at Hebron and said, behold, we are your bone and flesh. Why is that significant? Right on the heels of Saul's death, we're told in verse 1 that all Israel gathered at Hebron. In 2 Samuel, chapters 1 to 5, it takes David a long time to consolidate the kingdom. Now here it's pictured as they're consolidated because they all gather to David. The phrase is all Israel. And that's typical of Chronicles. It emphasizes the fact that when this was affected, it was all of Israel. We'll see a little more about that in a moment. All right, notice two metaphors that are used in verses 2 and 3 here. In times past, even when Saul was king, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. So they're saying to David, yeah, Saul was king, but who was doing all the fighting? You were. And so the Lord your God said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over my people Israel. So God said to David, you're going to be a shepherd and a prince. And those are meaningful passages, aren't they, in light of what eventually is going to happen with Jesus. Shepherd and prince. All right. Verse 3. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the king, and they anointed David king over Israel, according to the word of the Lord by Samuel. So David is now taking over the entire kingdom, not just part of the kingdom, and it's according to what God has decreed, what God desires. Now, verses 4 to 9, we looked at this last time in Samuel. David takes the city of Jerusalem, which was also called what? Who lived there? And you'll know the name of the city. Jebusites. Jebus. Well, he came and took it. It had been taken previously, early on, but apparently they lost it, so he retakes it. What's the significance of him taking that city? What's that city going to become? Kind of the capital of Israel, where the temple's going to be. So it's an important city, and it's probably a very strategic city, up high in elevation. Look at verse 9. And David became greater and greater. Why? The Lord of hosts was with him. So David's thriving, and it's with God's help. Lord of hosts means what? You could put another synonym for hosts. Starts with an A. Armies. Lord of armies. So the Lord's fighting for David, isn't he? All right, look at verse 10. Now these are the chiefs of David's mighty men. All right, so who are the mighty men? You remember these over in 2 Samuel toward the end of the book? That appendix is where it gives you a list of the mighty men, and guess who's last on that list? Uriah the Hittite, one of David's mighty men, is the very man that David slays, because he's taken Bathsheba. Well, here, it's mentioned here in chapters 11 and 12. Think about it. What's the significance of mighty men? David has some mighty men. What's that tell you about them or about David or whatever? What's that? Okay, support for him, and they're fighting for him. They're able fighters. Remember last time we saw he was being chased around by Saul? Well, at that cave of Adullam, guess who came to him? A bunch of men. Some of these must have been part of those. So there were three that are mentioned, and then there are 30 that are also mentioned. And that's just saying he had a contingent of men who was very interested in helping him. Look what it says. Who gave him strong support in his kingdom, together with who? Verse 10. Together with all Israel. Okay? To make him king according to the word of the Lord concerning Israel. You see how, and usually it's at the start of a section or at the end of the section, that the writer is telling us that this is all according to God's plan. Okay, so we're not going to describe all the different mighty men other than to notice, let's see what I've got here. There are some themes, verse 10, and we looked at these. David's king, it's all of Israel, it's according to the word of the Lord, and they give him strong support. So here's David ruling over all of Israel. Is he being supported in doing that? He is. Even though the kingdom had been divided for 7 years, wasn't it? Initially with Saul and David. Now it's united. So 3 and 30 are the number given for the mighty men. There are actually some more. But notice, they're loyal in their service. They have great skill and heroism. It's kind of interesting to read some of the descriptions. Look at chapter 12. Some of the men come to David at Ziklag. That's while he was with the Philistines just before Saul fights the Philistines. And it says, they were among the mighty men who helped him in war. They were bowmen and could shoot arrows and sling stones with either the right or the left hand. They were ambidextrous, weren't they? I mean, they could do it either way. And notice, they were what? Benjaminites. What's that tell you? These are men from Saul's tribe, and now they're loyal to David. They're fighting for David. All right, drop down to verse 8. From the Gadites there went over to David at the stronghold in the wilderness mighty and experienced warriors, expert with shield and spear, whose faces were like the faces of lions and who were like swiftest gazelles upon the mountains. I mean, David had some men fighting for them that had great ability. Look at verse 16. And some of the men of Benjamin and Judah came to the stronghold to David. Now notice what he says to them. He goes out to meet them and says, if you've come to me in friendship to help me, my heart will be joined to you. But if to betray me to my adversaries, although there's no wrong in my hands, then may the God of our fathers see and rebuke you. You better be supportive, you know. And so he takes them. Well, you know, we could spend more time. Verse 23, these are the numbers of the divisions of the armed troops who came to David in Hebron. So here is this account telling us about all these who gather to fight with David, chapters 11 and 12. Well, that's significant. He's made king, but he's got the support of the people. That's important, isn't it? Okay, let's look at the next section, chapters 13 to 16, which really focus on moving the ark from Kiriath Jearim, I think that's where it was, to Jerusalem. And I think we all know this story too. This is more detailed than in Samuel. Okay? First they try to bring it. Notice what verse 1 says, chapter 13. Is it verse 1? Yeah. David consulted with the commanders of thousands and hundreds, with every leader. Now what's that tell you about David right away? Compare that with Saul. David did what? He consulted with all the leaders. This isn't Saul being paranoid and saying, let's go get David. This is David asking the men, if it seems good to you and from the Lord our God, let us send abroad to our brothers who remain in all the lands of Israel, as well as to the priests and Levites in the cities that have pasture lands, that they may be gathered to us. Then let us bring again the ark of God to us. Why? What's he say? We're in verse 3. We didn't seek it in the days of Saul. Now, that word seek is important. Seeking the Lord, seeking the ark. That's kind of a theme that keeps going through Chronicles. Seeking the Lord. That's important. Saul didn't do that. All right, so David assembled all Israel from the Nile of Egypt to Lebo Hamath. I don't have a map, but tell me what those boundaries are. The Nile is where? Way south, and Lebo Hamath is way north. And so he's saying all of those came to help move the ark. Now, I don't think that literally means every single person showed up to move the ark, but whose support does he have? The entire nation's. And verse 6, David and all Israel went up to Baalah, that is to Kiriath Jearim, that belongs to Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God. Now notice, which is called by the name of the Lord, who sits enthroned above the cherubim. Okay. So let's put that up here on our chart. Get ready to move the ark. And the ark is described as being called by the name of the Lord. That means he's the owner, but it's also described as him sitting upon his throne. So we talk about the mercy seat, which it was, but picture it this way. God is sitting on his throne, and here's his footstool. So God's presence is among the people, even in reference to the ark. All right, we know the story, don't we? Uzzah reaches out to steal the ark because they're taking it on a cart. He dies. And David's reaction is both anger as well as fear. All right, look at chapter 14, which is between 13 and 15. Those are two attempts to bring the ark back to Jerusalem. Chapter 14 almost seems like, well, it's, what's it doing in there? David's family and his battles, but let's look at that. So chapter 14 is telling us a couple of things. All that Saul lost with the Philistines is now being reversed, because part of what chapter 14 is about is David conquering the Philistines. So I said earlier they were the nemesis of the Israelites. Now he's conquering them, which among other things does what as far as Jerusalem is concerned? They're going to move the ark to Jerusalem. What city would they like to have secure? Jerusalem would be good, wouldn't it? And so he defeats the Philistines. Notice down in verse 17, at the end of the chapter, what is said about him. And the fame of David went out into all lands, and the Lord brought the fear of him upon all nations. So what picture are we getting of David? He's expanding the kingdom. He's being successful, and now he's going to bring the ark to Jerusalem. So verses 1 and 2, Hiram's going to help with materials for the temple. We're told about David's wives, plural, and children, which among other things was a sign of blessing that he had many children. But then we're told in verses 5 to 17, the rest of chapter 14, about his victories over the Philistines. And I want you to notice what he does that Saul didn't do. What do you see down in there that David did that Saul didn't do? Can you skim through there and see chapter 14? Yeah, should we go up? He's inquiring and asking of God, should I go up? And we saw that last time, didn't we? What else does he do? Okay, would you give them into our hand? And then he asks a second time, should we go up? And God says yes. Look at verse 12. What'd they do when they defeated the Philistines? Chapter 14, verse 12. They left their gods there. What did a lot of armies like to do when they conquered other gods? They took them home and put them in their temple, trophies. He left them. What did Saul do when he went and he was supposed to utterly destroy the Amalekites? He brought some of the spoil back with him. David didn't do that. David consults the Lord. He leaves the spoil there. Again, verse 14, he inquires of God. God helps him to win the battle. Look at verse 16. And David did as God commanded him. Now, is this picture that David is perfect? Well, it might sound like that, but no, that's not the answer. I mean, even Chronicles has some of his failures. But what does his disposition seem to be in contrast to Saul? He's doing what God wants. He's seeking God. He's asking for God's help. God is helping him. Total contrast, isn't it, to Saul? Okay. All right, so that's chapter 14, but that's helping him win this victory. And so I said success versus failure. The kingdom's being established with God's blessing. Jerusalem's right there at the center. So chapter 15, a second time he's going to try to move the ark. So what do they do this time that they didn't do the first time? How do they carry the ark? They take poles like was instructed, and the priests carry it on their shoulders. And they successfully move it into the city of Jerusalem in a tent that David has made. I'll just kind of click through these. Only the Levites. Again, verse 3, all Israel is assembled. Consecrate yourselves, he says to the priests. We know we didn't do it right the first time. We're going to do it right this time. And so they carry it, and they bring it in, and they're rejoicing. And when they get there, chapter 16 is a chapter of praise to God. David praises God. So notice some of the themes of his giving thanks. Verses 8 to 13, he's praising God for what God has done for them. And then verses 14 to 18, interesting that he mentions among the blessings here, he says, verse 14, he's Lord our God, his judgments are in all the earth. Remember his covenant forever, the word he commanded for 1,000 generations, the covenant that he made with Abraham, his sworn promise to Isaac, which he confirmed to Jacob as a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant, saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as your portion for an inheritance. So verifying what God had done for Israel, for David, just according to what he said he would do. He said, though we were few in number, verse 19, of little account, sojourners wandering from nation to nation, yet God rebukes the kings on their account. Don't touch my anointed ones. And so David says, sing to the Lord, praise the Lord. He's king over all the earth, and yet, as great as he is, he's near to us. Look at verse 34. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Okay, so the ark is taken to Jerusalem. Now we come to chapter 17, which is like 2 Samuel chapter 7. David proposes to build a house for God. He says, I'm living in my house. What about God's house? And Nathan says, go ahead. And then God says to Nathan, no, hold on. David's not going to build me a house. So let's just kind of notice the different points here. Verse 4, you will not build me a house. Okay. Thus says the Lord, it is not you who will build me a house to dwell in, for I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up Israel to this day. So what's God kind of saying effectively there? Okay, not confined. And yeah, okay, so it's not really up to David to decide. And God says, actually, I haven't had a house for a long time, so I'm not in need of a house, not confined. Okay, I don't know that that's necessarily a rebuke of David, but God is just saying, in my own time, in my own way. I've gone to tent and from dwelling to dwelling in all places where I've moved with all Israel. Did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel whom I commanded? Sorry, I just lost my place. Okay, so verse 6. So why have you not, did I ask you, why have you not built me a house of cedar? So he says to Nathan, say to David, verse 7, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be prince over my people. We saw that earlier. I've been with you wherever you've gone and cut off all your enemies from before you. And then Verse 8, I will make for you a name like the name of the great ones of the earth. Who does that remind you of? I think we mentioned this before. Same promise he made to Abraham. Your name will be great. Now he says to David, and I think David's the only other one to whom he says this. I will make your name great, and I have been with you wherever you've gone and have cut off all your enemies. Make for you a name like the name of the great ones of the earth, and I will appoint a place for my people Israel and will plant them, that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. What's the idea of disturbed no more? What's another word for that? You shall have peace or rest. So I'm giving you this land, not just so you'll have a land, but so you'll have rest. And ultimately, of course, what is the real rest? It's not that land. Ultimately, it's heaven, what we know from New Testament teaching. Okay. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, you're not going to build it for me. I'm going to build it for you. And so let's look at that part right there. Verse 11. Moreover, I declare to you, the Lord will build you a house. Verse 10. When your days are fulfilled to walk with your fathers, I'll raise up your offspring after you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. Okay, I think we're going to actually make it through this slide here. So we know these elements of this, nothing new. And then he says, he shall build me a house. The Son shall build me a house, and I will establish his throne forever. And then what's the relationship? Verse 13, father and son. I shall be to him a father, he shall be to me a son. You know, often in some of these pagan nations, the king was looked upon as kind of the representative of whatever the deity was. Well, God says, I'm the father, and he'll be my son. And that wasn't just used of the king, it was used of Israel initially, and it's going to be used of others after this. So, verse 12, he'll build me a house, father-son relationship. Verse 13, and then verse 14, I will confirm him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forever. Now, the last part of the chapter, which we don't have time to look at, is David praising God for what he's promised. But that kind of sets up Solomon's reign because, among other things, I think primarily Solomon's reign is all about building this house. And Solomon serving as the son who takes over the throne, and God has promised that he'll establish that throne forever. So here's where we'll end tonight. Remember back in chapter 8, we looked at this problem of the people want a king, and we said, well, you know, it almost sounds like it's problematic. There's something flawed about it. And God says, go ahead and give them a king. Well, how does that seem to be resolved here in 1 Chronicles 17? Is this something that God was a little bit uncertain about, and he didn't really know if we're going to do this king thing or not? No. Yeah. His plan was, yeah, you're going to have a king. You're going to have an everlasting king. And what we're going to find out is that through the course of the history of the kings, there were some good ones, there were a lot of bad ones, but nobody was really the model king. But God was going to send somebody who would be the model king. Which, you know, like he's done in other cases, demonstrating that, okay, yeah, this is kind of foreshadowing this, but ultimately this is what's going to happen. Okay, so we'll stop right there. Next time, we'll look at lesson 4, Solomon's reign, and we'll try to sort of condense his building the temple, David helping him build the temple. I think that's a part of lesson 4. So we'll be looking at those chapters. Levon pointed out some of the references in the lesson sheet talk about chapters 22, 23, 24. That's in 1 Chronicles. I don't think I had that for some reason, so All right, we'll stop there and take up next time.